The restaurant was loud, silverware clinking, glasses toasting, laughter filling every corner. But at table 15, the most dangerous man in the city sat in absolute silence. He didn't come here for dinner. He came here to meet someone who was supposed to be dead. But before the waiter even reached his table, something slid across the floor and touched his shoe. A crumpled napkin. He almost ignored it until he saw the handwriting. Small, shaky, written in a child's hand. Just one word, help. He looked up. Across the room, a little girl stood frozen beside her mother. Her lips trembling, her eyes begging, her tiny hand still half hidden behind her dress, as if she wasn't sure the message had reached the right person. Behind her, a man in a leather jacket tightened his grip on her shoulder. Too tight, possessive, dangerous. The waiter walked right past her, completely missing the fear carved into her eyes. But the mafia boss didn't. His fingers slowly curled around the napkin, crushing it like a trigger he was seconds away from pulling. She had chosen him. Of all people in this room, she had chosen the one man capable of turning a quiet dinner into a war zone. And when he stood up, every bodyguard in the room froze because they had never seen that look in his eyes. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will shake the entire criminal underworld and reveal why this little girl risked everything to reach the monster at table 15. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Dominic Castellano had been called many things in his 43 years: monster, king, devil. But tonight, sitting in Carmine's Italian bistro, he was just a man waiting for answers about a betrayal that had cost him everything 6 months ago. The restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd, couples celebrating anniversaries, families sharing pasta, business deals being struck over wine. None of them knew they were eating dinner 20 feet away from the head of the most feared crime family on the East Coast. Dominic preferred it that way. Anonymity was power. The moment people recognized you, they either ran or started planning your funeral. He'd learned that lesson watching his father get gunned down outside a pizzeria when he was 12. His fingers drummed against the white tablecloth as he scanned the room. Carlo should have been here 15 minutes ago. Carlo, his former lieutenant, his childhood friend, the man who had supposedly died in a warehouse explosion that destroyed $3 million worth of merchandise and nearly triggered a war between the families. But Carlo wasn't dead. Dominic had proof, photos, bank records, witness statements from people too terrified to lie. Carlo had staged his own death, stolen the money, and was now living under a new identity in Miami. Tonight was supposed to be their reunion. Dominic had sent word through the old channels. A simple message. Table 15, Carmine's 9 o'clock. Come alone or don't come at all. The clock on the wall read 9:17. Dominic's jaw tightened. Disrespect was a cancer in his world. You let one person get away with it, and suddenly everyone thought they could test you. He'd built his reputation on swift, brutal responses to even the smallest slights. But before he could signal his men to start looking for Carlo, something caught his attention. A flash of movement near the hostess station. A family being seated 3 tables away. The woman was in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a floral dress that had seen better days. She kept glancing toward the exit, her hands shaking as she reached for her water glass. The man beside her was older, maybe mid-40s, with graying temples and expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the hardness in his eyes. He spoke in low, controlled tones, his hand resting possessively on the woman's arm. And between them sat a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Something about the scene felt wrong. Dominic had spent decades reading people, learning to spot lies, fear, and danger in the tilt of a head or the twitch of an eye. This wasn't a happy family dinner. The woman flinched when the man leaned over to whisper something in her ear. The little girl sat perfectly still, like she was afraid that moving might trigger something terrible. Dominic's attention might have drifted back to watching for Carlo, but then the little girl turned and looked directly at him. Most children would have looked away immediately, intimidated by his cold stare. This one held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and in those seconds, Dominic saw something he recognized. Pure, desperate terror. The kind of fear that came from knowing you were trapped with no way out. The same fear he'd seen in his own reflection after his father's murder. when the rival families circled like vultures, waiting to carve up their territory. The little girl's eyes darted to her napkin, then back to Dominic. She picked up her crayon, the one she'd been using to color the children's menu, and began writing something. Dominic watched as she carefully tore off a corner of her napkin and crumpled it into a tiny ball. The man beside her was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages with the intensity of someone conducting business. The woman stared at her untouched plate of food, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. That's when the little girl made her move. She dropped the crumpled napkin and gave it a small kick under the table. Dominic watched it roll across the restaurant floor, weaving between chair legs and server stations until it came to rest against his Italian leather shoe. He bent down slowly, his movements casual, like he was adjusting his pant leg. His fingers closed around the tiny ball of paper. When he unfolded it, his blood turned to ice. The word was written in purple crayon, the letters uneven and shaky, but unmistakably clear. Dominic's eyes snapped back to the little girl. She was still watching him, her small face a mask of controlled panic. She gave the slightest nod, confirming what he already knew. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This child was in genuine danger. The man at their table suddenly looked up from his phone, his gaze sweeping the restaurant with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to watching for threats. When his eyes passed over Dominic, they lingered for just a moment too long. Recognition flickered there, not the kind that came from seeing someone on the news or in a photograph. This was the recognition of one predator identifying another. Dominic folded the napkin and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His mind was already calculating angles, exits, witnesses, and the number of innocent people who might get caught in crossfire if this situation exploded into violence. But first, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The man's phone buzzed. He answered it with a curt, his voice carrying just far enough for Dominic to catch fragments. Something about a schedule, a departure time. The phrase package delivery spoken with the kind of emphasis that suggested it wasn't about shipping boxes. Dominic's jaw clenched. In his world, packages often referred to people who were being moved against their will. The waiter approached their table, a young kid with nervous energy and a smile that suggested he was working for tips. The man ordered for all three of them without consulting the woman or child. "We're in a hurry," he told the waiter. "Make it quick." The woman's hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold her water glass. The little girl sat motionless, her coloring abandoned, her eyes now fixed on the table as if she was afraid to look up again. Dominic's phone vibrated. A text from Sal, one of his lieutenants positioned near the front entrance. "Still no sign of Carlo. You want us to start looking?" Dominic typed back. "Hold position. Something else is happening." He needed more information before he acted. Moving too quickly could put the child in more danger. But waiting too long might mean losing his only chance to help her. The man at their table stood up abruptly. "I'm going to make a call," he announced, his hand briefly squeezing the woman's shoulder in what looked like affection, but felt like a warning. As he walked toward the restaurant's rear exit, Dominic caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The outline of a gun barely visible beneath the man's jacket. Dominic had two choices. He could mind his own business, wait for Carlo, and handle his own problems like he'd planned. Or he could intervene in a situation that had nothing to do with him, potentially exposing his location and putting his own operation at risk. But then he looked at the little girl again, saw the way she glanced hopefully toward the exit where the man had disappeared, as if calculating whether she could run. Dominic Castellano had done terrible things in his life. He'd ordered deaths, destroyed families, and built an empire on fear and violence. But he'd never hurt a child, and he'd never walked away from one who needed help. His hand moved to his phone, fingers hovering over Sal's number. The next few minutes would determine whether this quiet Friday night dinner turned into a rescue mission or a massacre. The decision crystallized in Dominic's mind like ice forming on glass. He pressed Sal's number. "Change of plans," he whispered into the phone, his eyes never leaving the woman and child. "I need you to run a plate for me. Black sedan, 3 cars down from the main entrance. And Sal, do it quiet. Boss, what about Carlo? Can wait. We've got a bigger problem." Dominic ended the call and studied the restaurant layout with tactical precision. 2 exits, 17 tables, roughly 40 civilians, and at least 3 of his own men positioned throughout the room. The man with the gun had been gone for 4 minutes now, too long for a simple phone call. The little girl's head snapped up suddenly, her eyes wide with fresh panic. She was staring toward the back of the restaurant where the man had disappeared. Dominic followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. The man was returning, but he wasn't alone. Another figure walked beside him, shorter, stockier, with the kind of walk that suggested military training. This second man's jacket hung loose, deliberately concealing what Dominic knew was certainly another weapon. The woman at the table saw them coming, and her face went ashen. She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it so tightly the little girl winced. Dominic's phone buzzed. Sal's response was faster than expected. Sedans registered to a shell company. Same company owns a warehouse in the industrial district. Boss, this doesn't smell right. Shell companies. Warehouses. Armed escorts. The pieces were forming a picture Dominic had seen before, one that made his blood boil with a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. Human trafficking. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a custody dispute or a family argument. This was something far worse. The woman and child weren't just in danger. They were merchandise. The 2 men reached the table, and Dominic watched the choreography of control play out. The original man sat down while his partner remained standing, positioning himself where he could watch both the table and the room. Classic protection formation, but they weren't protecting the family. They were guarding their investment. The little girl's coloring crayon rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. When she bent to pick it up, she glanced once more toward Dominic. This time, her message was different. Her lips moved silently, forming words only he could read. Please. Dominic's hand moved to his jacket, fingers brushing the grip of his pistol. But starting a gunfight in a crowded restaurant would be suicide legally and tactically. Too many witnesses, too many innocent people, too much exposure. He needed a different approach. Standing slowly, Dominic smoothed his suit jacket and walked toward the restroom area, passing close enough to the family's table to overhear fragments of conversation. Flight leaves at 11, the first man was saying. We need to be at the pickup point by 10:30. The package is getting restless, the second man replied, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone discussing cargo rather than human beings. Package. The same word he'd heard on the phone call. In the restroom, he dialed another number. This time, it wasn't one of his lieutenants. Detective Harper, it's Dominic. Yeah, I know what time it is. I need a favor. And before you say no, remember who kept your daughter out of that mess with the Colombians last year. Harper's voice was weary but attentive. What do you need? I'm at Carmine's on 5th Street. Table near the back has a trafficking situation. Woman and a child. 2 armed escorts. They're talking about a flight at 11. Dominic, I can't just take your word and rate a restaurant based on the kid pass me a note asking for help. Harper, I've done a lot of terrible things in my life, but I don't lie about children in danger. A long pause. I'll send a unit for a wellness check, but if this is some kind of setup, it's not. And detective, tell them to come quiet. These guys are armed and jumpy. Dominic ended the call and checked his watch. 9:34. If the police moved fast, they could intercept before any transfer occurred. But if they were too slow, or if the traffickers spooked and decided to cut their losses, he couldn't take that chance. Walking back through the restaurant, Dominic made a decision that would either save 2 lives or end his own criminal career in spectacular fashion. He approached the family's table directly. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the polite authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Dominic Castellano, and I believe your daughter dropped this. He held up the crumpled napkin. The effect was immediate and electric. The first man's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. The second man shifted his weight, ready to draw. The woman's eyes went wide with a mixture of hope and terror, but it was the little girl's reaction that mattered most. She looked up at Dominic with the kind of desperate gratitude that could break a hardened heart. I'm sorry, the first man said, his voice tight with barely controlled aggression. Do we know you? Dominic smiled, the expression cold enough to freeze blood. No, but I know you, and more importantly, I know what you're doing. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. At surrounding tables, other diners continued their conversations, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the opening moves of what could become a war. I think there's been a misunderstanding, the second man said, his hand now openly resting on his concealed weapon. The only misunderstanding, Dominic replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout, is you thinking you could conduct business in my city without my knowledge. The woman looked confused, not understanding the criminal terminology being exchanged above her head, but the little girl understood perfectly. She'd grown up in this world of coded threats and veiled violence. Her small hand crept across the table toward her mother's, seeking comfort in what might be their last moments together. That gesture, so innocent and terrifying, made Dominic's decision for him. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to Sal. Now, within 30 seconds, 3 of Dominic's men appeared at strategic locations throughout the restaurant. Not obvious enough to alarm the other diners, but visible enough to send a clear message to the traffickers. They were surrounded. Here's what's going to happen, Dominic said, settling into an empty chair at their table without invitation. You're going to sit quietly, order dessert, and wait for some friends of mine to arrive. And if you do anything at all that puts this woman or child in danger, I will personally ensure that your last moments on Earth are more painful than you can possibly imagine. The first man's face flushed with anger and fear. You have no idea who you're messing with. Dominic leaned forward, his eyes becoming chips of black ice. I'm Dominic Castellano. I own this city from the docks to the suburbs. I've killed men for looking at me wrong, and I've started wars over matters of principle. But most importantly, I've never ever let anyone hurt a child in my presence. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. In the distance, barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise, came the sound of sirens approaching. The little girl heard them too. For the first time since Dominic had been watching, she smiled. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the restaurant's ambient chatter like a blade through silk. Dominic watched the 2 traffickers exchange panicked glances, their carefully constructed facade cracking under pressure. The first man's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen, his face going pale. We need to leave now. Nobody's leaving, Dominic said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, especially not with them. The woman finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Who are you people? What's happening? Dominic turned to her, his expression softening just enough to seem human. Ma'am, your nightmare is about to end. But I need you to trust me and stay very still. The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mommy, the nice man is helping us. Nice man. Dominic almost smiled at that. He'd been called many things, but nice wasn't one of them. Yet somehow, this 8-year-old had seen past his reputation to something deeper. The second trafficker was growing agitated, his hand twitching toward his concealed weapon. This is insane. We're walking out of here right now. Try it, Dominic said, his tone dropping to absolute zero. See what happens. As if summoned by his words, Sal appeared beside their table, his massive frame blocking any potential escape route. Behind him, Dominic could see his other men moving into position, casual but deadly. The restaurant's front door chimed, and 2 plain detectives entered, their trained eyes immediately scanning the room. Detective Harper was one of them, a thin man with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much. Dominic caught Harper's eye and gave the slightest nod toward their table. The detective's gaze shifted to the family, taking in the woman's terrified expression, the little girl's tear-stained cheeks, and the 2 men who looked like they were seconds away from bolting. Evening, folks, Harper said, approaching with his badge visible, but not threatening. We received a call about a possible disturbance. Everything all right here? The first trafficker forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Just a family dinner, officer. No problems here. Is that so? Harper's partner, Detective Kane, a younger detective with sharp eyes, focused on the woman. Ma'am, are you here voluntarily? The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Years of conditioning, threats, and fear had taught her that speaking up only made things worse. But the little girl had no such conditioning. They took us from our house, she said, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. They said we were going on a trip, but we didn't want to go. The man said bad things would happen to Mommy if I didn't behave. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harper's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon while his partner stepped closer to the family. Sweetheart, Detective Kane said gently, can you tell me your name? Sofia Martinez. This is my mommy, Carmen. We live on Maple Street. But these men came to our house 3 days ago. 3 days. Dominic felt a cold rage building in his chest. These monsters had been terrorizing a mother and child for 3 days, and nobody had noticed they were missing. The first trafficker made his move then, lunging to his feet and reaching for his gun. But he'd forgotten about Sal, who moved with surprising speed for such a large man. The trafficker's wrist cracked audibly as Sal twisted it, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. The second man tried to run, but Dominic was ready. He rose smoothly, intercepting the fleeing trafficker with a precise movement that sent him crashing into an empty table. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Diners screamed and dove for cover. Chairs overturned. Glasses shattered. But through it all, Dominic kept his eyes on Sofia and Carmen, making sure they stayed safe. "Get them out of here," he told Harper, who was already moving to shield the family. "Dominic," the detective said quietly, "I need you to step back. Let us handle this." "They're handled," Dominic replied, watching as Sal zip-tied both traffickers while they groaned on the floor. "But this is bigger than just these two idiots." He pulled out his phone and showed Harper a series of text messages Sal had forwarded. Bank transfers, warehouse addresses, shipping schedules. They're part of a network. Shell companies, offshore accounts, the whole operation. This family was supposed to be on a cargo ship by midnight, heading to God knows where. Harper studied the information, his expression growing darker. "How did you get all this?" Dominic's smile was razor-sharp. "I have my methods. But detective, if you want to shut down the entire pipeline, you need to move fast. They've got more people, more locations." The little girl, Sofia, had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. Now she approached Dominic, tugging on his expensive suit jacket. "Mister," she said, "are you a good guy or a bad guy?" The question hit Dominic like a physical blow. He'd spent his entire adult life being unquestionably the bad guy. He'd hurt people, destroyed lives, built an empire on fear and violence. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he'd used that power to protect the innocent. He knelt down to Sofia's eye level, his voice gentle in a way that would have shocked his enemies. "I'm complicated, sweetheart, but tonight I'm on your side." Sofia nodded solemnly, then surprised him by wrapping her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "Thank you for saving us." Dominic felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he'd built years ago crumbling under the weight of a child's gratitude. Carmen Martinez finally found her voice. "I don't understand what happened. Who were those men? Why did they take us?" Harper exchanged a glance with Dominic before answering. "Ma'am, you and your daughter were victims of human trafficking. These men were planning to sell you." The words hung in the air like poison. Carmen's legs gave out, and she would have collapsed if Sal hadn't caught her arm. "But why us?" she whispered. "We're nobody special. We don't have money or connections." "Or that's exactly why," Dominic said grimly. "People who won't be missed right away. Single mothers, children, immigrants, anyone society tends to overlook." He turned to Harper. "Detective, they mentioned a warehouse in the industrial district. Shell company called Atlantic Holdings. If you move now, you might catch the rest of the operation." Harper was already on his radio, calling for backup and search warrants. Within minutes, the restaurant was swarming with federal agents, local police, and crime scene investigators. Dominic watched it all unfold with the satisfaction of a job well done. But he also knew his night was far from over. Carlos still hadn't shown up, which meant either he was dead, in hiding, or planning something even more dangerous. Sofia appeared at his side again, having broken away from the paramedics who were checking her over. "Dominic," she said, "will you make sure they don't come back for us?" The question revealed a wisdom beyond her years. She understood that removing 2 men didn't eliminate the threat. These organizations had tentacles everywhere, connections that ran deep into legitimate businesses and corrupt officials. Dominic looked at this brave little girl who had risked everything on the hope that a stranger might help her, and made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire criminal career. "Sofia," he said, "I promise you that no one will ever hurt you or your mother again. I give you my word." It was a promise that would cost him millions in protection expenses, require him to declare war on trafficking operations throughout the city, and force him to walk a line between his criminal empire and something resembling justice. But as he watched Sophia's face light up with relief and hope, Dominic realized that some promises were worth any price. The little girl who had written help on a napkin had done more than save herself and her mother. She had reminded a monster that somewhere deep inside, he still had a soul worth saving. And that revelation would shake the criminal underworld to its very foundations. The warehouse raid that followed would become legend in law enforcement circles. Within 2 hours of Sophia's rescue, federal agents had surrounded the Atlantic Holdings facility like a steel trap closing. What they found inside defied their worst expectations. 43 people, men, women, children, all scheduled for transport within the next 6 hours. The operation was bigger than anyone had imagined, with connections stretching from the Canadian border down to Mexico and beyond. But Dominic wasn't there to see the arrests. He had other business to attend to. At 11:47 p.m., his phone finally rang. Carlo, the ghost who had started this entire evening. Dominic came the familiar voice, though it carried an edge Dominic had never heard before. Heard you caused quite a scene at Carmine's tonight. Where are you, Carlo? Close enough to know you just declared war on some very dangerous people. The Volkov organization doesn't forgive interference with their business operations. Dominic felt ice form in his veins. The Volkovs, Russian mafia, the most ruthless trafficking network on the East Coast. He just painted a target on his back that would never disappear. You set me up, Dominic said. The pieces finally clicking into place. The meeting, the restaurant, the timing. You knew they'd be there. Carlo laughed, but there was no warmth in it. I needed you distracted while I handled some unfinished business. Your warehouse on Pier 47, $3 million in cash and product. Consider it payment for all those years of friendship. The line went dead. Dominic stared at his phone, realizing he'd been played by a master. While he was rescuing Sophia and Carmen, Carlo had been robbing him blind. But the betrayal ran deeper than money. Carlo had known about the trafficking operation, had probably been feeding information to the Volkovs for months. Dominic's own lieutenant had been complicit in the horror they'd witnessed tonight. Sal appeared beside him, his face grim. Boss, Pier 47 is cleaned out. Professional job. They knew exactly where everything was hidden. How much? Everything. Cash reserves, product, the entire Eastern operation's liquid assets. Dominic nodded slowly. In one night, he'd lost a fortune, gained deadly enemies, and discovered that his closest friend was a traitor. By any measure, it should have been a disaster. But when he looked back toward the restaurant where crime scene tape fluttered in the night breeze, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Sofia Martinez was safe. Her mother was safe. 43 other victims had been rescued. The trafficking network would be crippled for years. Sometimes the right choice was also the most expensive one. Dominic's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Harper. Federal Task Force wants to meet. They need someone with your connections to help dismantle the entire network. Interested in doing some good for once. Dominic looked at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back. When and where? The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Dominic Castellano was still the head of a criminal empire. Still a dangerous man with blood on his hands. But Sophia's napkin had started something that couldn't be undone. Within a week, word spread through the underworld that Dominic's organization was off limits to human traffickers. Anyone caught moving people through his territory would face consequences that made prison look like a vacation. The Volkovs tested him twice. Both times their operations simply vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found, but the message was clear. Children were untouchable. 3 months later, Dominic received a drawing in the mail. It showed a stick-figure man in a black suit standing next to a little girl and her mother. Above it in purple crayon, Sophia had written, "Thank you for keeping your promise." He framed it and hung it in his office. Right next to a photo of his father, 2 reminders of what mattered most. Legacy wasn't about the empire you built or the enemies you destroyed. It was about the moments when you chose to be better than what the world expected. Dominic Castellano had spent 43 years being the monster everyone feared. But one 8-year-old girl with a crayon had reminded him that monsters could choose to be protectors instead. The war with the Volkovs would rage for years. Carlo would eventually surface only to disappear again under circumstances that remained classified. The Federal Task Force would dismantle trafficking networks across 7 states using Dominic's intelligence and connections. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth Sophia had taught him that night. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who you want on your side when evil shows its face. And sometimes a crumpled napkin with one word written in crayon can change the entire course of a man's life. The monster at table 15 had become something else entirely. Something that would terrify the right people for all the right reasons. Because Dominic Castellano had learned that true power wasn't about being feared. It was about being the person a frightened child trusted to save her life. And that's the story of how one word written in purple crayon changed everything. Dominic Castellano walked into Carmine's that night expecting to confront a traitor and left having discovered something far more valuable than the millions Carlo had stolen from him. Sofia Martinez taught him that true power isn't measured in fear or territory or blood spilled. It's measured in the moments when you choose to protect instead of destroy. When you use your strength to shield the innocent instead of crush your enemies. The trafficking network crumbled. 43 lives were saved, and a monster learned he could choose to be a guardian instead. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who a frightened child needs on their side. Sometimes evil wears expensive suits and sits at corner tables. And sometimes a crumpled napkin becomes the first domino in a chain reaction that reshapes an entire criminal empire. Dominic kept that napkin in his wallet for the rest of his life. A reminder that redemption can come from the most unexpected places. Written in the shakiest handwriting, delivered by the smallest hands. 3 months after that night at Carmine's, Dominic sat in his office, staring at the framed drawing that had arrived in the morning mail. The stick-figure man in the black suit stood protectively next to a little girl and her mother, all 3 figures smiling under a bright yellow sun. Sophia's careful lettering spelled out her message in purple crayon. Thank you for keeping your promise. The federal task force meeting was scheduled for noon. Agent Collins had been persistent, calling twice a week with updates on the trafficking network dismantling. 7 states, 43 arrests, and counting. Dominic's intelligence had proven invaluable in tracking down the remaining Volkov operatives. The war with the Russian organization had been swift and brutal. They tested his resolve twice, sending low-level traffickers through his territory to see if his protection promise was real. Both operations vanished without a trace. No bodies were found, but the message echoed through the criminal underworld. Children were untouchable in Castellano territory. Carlo surfaced once more, 3 weeks ago, calling from a payphone in Miami. The conversation lasted 30 seconds before the line went dead. By the time Dominic's people reached the location, Carlo had disappeared again. Some ghosts, Dominic realized, preferred to stay buried. He touched the lighthouse pendant Sophia had described during her police interview, the one Isabella Romano had given Emma in another lifetime. Different story, same courage. Same choice to trust a dangerous stranger when hope seemed lost. The intercom buzzed. "Boss, Agent Collins is here. Send him in." As Collins entered with his briefcase full of federal paperwork, Dominic glanced once more at Sophia's drawing. Legacy wasn't built in boardrooms or back alleys. It was built in moments when power chose protection over profit. Sometimes redemption came wrapped in purple crayon, delivered by the smallest hands.